Hello yet again, and welcome to Chapter 8, The Changing Organization of School. Now last week I spoke about the influence of school structure, and this week I'm focusing on how the organization of schools have changed. From how the administration of authority has changed and what is considered acceptable administration of authority, to how student motivation is viewed now compared to the past, and how the education system as a whole, as well as individual schools, have turned into these big bureaucratic structures. We are all very familiar in general with how the education system in Canada as a whole is organized, with how most individual schools are organized, and we're generally familiar with how restrictive this can sometimes be in various ways. Well, how did this all come to be? What's the reasoning behind all of it? Thinking back to the previous class where I focused on how our education system evolved, we know that in Canada, our system went from being comprised of a pretty loose group of small schools that were not strictly regulated or controlled or monitored, and thus often not very similar, to a centralized system in which strict regulations and controls have now been in place for decades. In other words, schools were governed and operated by traditional authority. During this time, teachers were in many ways viewed as substitute parents for students, with the responsibility to look after students as their parents would. The proper term for this is in loco parentis, which means having parent-like authority. And you know, it's kind of weird for us to think of teachers this way now, isn't it? If anything, students in our time are more likely to look at a teacher and say, "You're not my mom, you're not my dad," meaning I don't have to listen to you in the same way I listen to my parents. I don't have to automatically defer to your authority because you're not my parent. Well, in loco parentis was the opposite. Teachers had the same automatic authority that parents did. It was acceptable for them to spank you or discipline you as a parent would, to yell at you as a parent would, and to use their own judgment in discipline, all of it. And everyone, including your actual parents, would accept this and support it. As you're well aware, this has changed, not just a little bit, significantly. The teacher role has been redefined, and the student role has been redefined. The students are no longer expected to automatically obey their teachers, or really any authority figure in the education system, simply because of their position. Students know this, and teachers know this, and parents know this. Now, students are much more aware of, and in many ways encouraged to assert their individual rights, no matter what the situation. And teachers know this too. Parents are much more likely to advocate on the part of their children in school, no matter what, even when their children are clearly at fault for something and in the wrong. So let's say their child has been continuously disruptive in some way, affecting the entire class. They've been clearly disrespectful to the teacher, perhaps swearing at them. Whatever the specifics are, the parent makes excuses for their child and believes disruptive behavior is simply part of the job. And teachers know this. So now, instead of traditional authority in education, legal rational authority has become the norm. What does legal rational authority encompass? Several things. It includes having to provide a clear, distinct, indisputable rationalization or justification for everything, no matter how minute. Why is that course part of the curriculum? Why does assessment occur in that way? Why do we not keep students after school for detention? For me, I can especially see the difference between traditional authority in education and legal rational authority in regards to discipline. To me, that is just a shining example. In the past, it was not only acceptable for a student to be subject to corporal discipline at school, it was considered a very positive approach, a very positive and proactive thing to do in order to deter future negative behavior. That might have meant being strapped with a belt over your clothes, having your hand hit with a ruler or something else. Now, I never went through that at school, but even in the 70s, this still continued to occur. Even if corporal punishment was not used, other methods of discipline were very common. Writing lines on the board, having to clean a classroom or assist in cleaning the whole school, detentions for an hour after school, much more strict requirements to be allowed to participate in extracurricular activities. But this focus on traditional authority waned, and instead, over several decades, changed into a focus on legal rational authority, in which the personal rights of a student are always front and center. Parents are expected to participate in determining what kind of authority and punishment at school is okay. Now, in the United States, there are still many schools where corporal punishment is permitted, whether that means spanking with a hand over the clothes, paddling with a wooden paddle, rapping a student on the hand with a ruler, or something similar to these. There are many schools where this is permitted, including high schools, not just elementary schools. This is an issue people tend to have an either-or opinion about. It's not something that you can really sit on the fence about, and opinions tend to be very strong. For those opposed to it, their argument is that this does not actually teach students anything. It's not needed, and there are other methods of disciplining students that model better behavior. For those who support some kind of corporal punishment, they say that for young people it seems to be the only thing that gets through to them, that they no longer care about detentions or other forms of discipline. And teachers who support it point out that it is not used very often. In fact, just the threat of it is enough to convince a student to behave. I still remember reading an article about this several years ago. I couldn't tell you who the author was now, what it was in, but there was an interview with an elementary school teacher in it who supported corporal punishment, because the teacher said that there are times, not very often, but there are times when no matter what they do or what approach they take, a student simply will not settle down and behave properly and get their work done. But if they tell the student that they have no other option but to get the principal involved, as soon as they walk over to where the classroom phone is to call the principal, the student's attitude and behavior changes. So that's all it takes, according to this teacher, is even just the threat of being punished physically. And that they found this is the only punishment that's guaranteed to work as a deterrent. So basically they're saying even when corporal punishment is allowed, it's very, very rarely used because just the threat of it being used seems to be enough. So I've got a link to a YouTube video here. It's just about 5 minutes and 40 seconds talking about should teachers use corporal punishment on students. So please go into the PowerPoint and make sure you watch that. Now, during the same decades that traditional authority was eroding, schools themselves were becoming quite a bit larger. More and more students were attending fewer schools, but larger schools. Everything about the education system was becoming standardized, and rules and regulations were being solidified and generalized to apply to everybody. Instead of just those actually working in the education system having a say, parents were not only allowed, but they began to be invited to become more involved, to have a say in how schools operated. We had more student organizations and student councils and parent councils. As stated in your text, this is a story of standardization. Now, there are two main things I want to point out in regard to this legal, rational authority developing. One pretty obvious and one not so much. So the first I've already alluded to, that schools became highly bureaucratized, something that all of us, including my generation, are completely used to at this point. In order to do anything in any way, we have to follow certain channels and rules and regulations in education and fill out forms and speak to very specific people. We have dress codes and behavioral regulations and dates and deadlines for everything. Not even referring to student work, just how schools operate. In elementary schools, we now have agendas, which all include a copy of the rules at school. We have teachers with specific credentials, specifically trained for every subject and every grade level, and often for specific student needs. Schools really are run like big corporations. They say they're not, they insist they're not, and nobody likes to acknowledge they are, because the idea of schools being so impartial and impersonal is not something we like, since they deal with children. But the fact is, in many ways, they are. At a school board, there are accessibility standards and administrative guidelines and safe school guidelines in various committees. Multi-year planning committees, finance committees, director's performance appraisal committee, parent involvement committee, audit committee, equity advisory council, special education advisory committee, First Nations advisory committee, transportation appeals committee. And the education system as a whole is very top heavy. The amount of administration has expanded enormously and continues to. So even the public board in the North Bay area, which is Northern Ontario, so it's not as big, we have a director of education, a superintendent of business, 2 superintendents of education, superintendent of teaching and learning, a board of trustees for each specific geographic area with a chair for the board, and a manual and bylaws to follow, a communications officer, a communications coordinator. There is really no way to deny that schools at all levels are run like corporations, that they contain a great deal of bureaucracy. So that's one main change as traditional authority eroded and schools increasingly became governed by legal rational authority. The second thing I want to point out is that as part of this bureaucratization of schools, students have often been perceived and openly treated more as clients. That might not seem like a big thing. This might seem like a small thing, but it's not, because when you're a client of something, that necessarily implies that as a client you're owed something and that you should be perceived and treated in a certain way. As a teacher, how best can I tailor what I do to serve you, to suit you as a student? As a teacher, it is my job to figure out what you need and the best way for you to receive what you need, and then take charge of doing it. And I will do that for every single student. Is that really what a teacher is supposed to do? Is that really what the job of a teacher is supposed to be? Actually, no. But it's widely perceived and widely accepted as part of the job. Generally speaking, a teacher's job is to assist students in growing and developing their intellect, a process that will also entail increasing their maturity and emotional and psychological development. But those last 3 things, maturity and emotional and psychological development, they're not actually part of a teacher's job. But because of how intellect works, they end up being part of it. Teachers are not social workers or therapists or speech pathologists or occupational or physical therapy experts or counselors. A teacher's job does not even include being an expert or specialist in learning strategies. That would be the job of a specialist. None of those things are the job of a regular teacher, no matter the grade they teach or the subject area. But they are now expected to be at least minor experts in all of these areas. And I don't mean this to paint teachers as victims, to make it seem like they're totally downtrodden. But all of those extra duties I just mentioned are in fact not the job or expertise of a regular teacher. Yet students are in a lot of ways viewed as their clients, as the school board's client. No matter what a student's academic aptitude is, their level of motivation, no matter how they behave in school, no matter the basic skills they lack or their parents' lack of involvement, Teachers are supposed to do everything they can to reach the same outcome with every student. And if they don't, it's not uncommon for the teacher to be viewed as failing with the student and for the student's parents to feel the teacher failed, which is totally 100% not fair. I spoke previously about how schools are often perceived as factories, a standardized production process in which everything is exactly the same. But the problem is, in a factory, when there's something that prevents a product from being produced in the standard way, in the way it's supposed to be produced, that is recognized and dealt with. So the people working in the factory, the bosses, the suppliers as well, if there's an issue with any kind of raw material, the factory employees and the bosses and the suppliers see that and take steps to fix it. Well, we can't do that in a school. So let's say Jennifer's parents do not provide support for completing homework at home. Her parents do not respond to phone calls from the school. She often doesn't have a lunch to bring to school. Her parents let her stay up as late as she wants at night, so she's always fallen asleep in class. In other words, the suppliers are not doing their part. A school can't say, sorry, she can't go to school here. There's too many problems beyond our control, and we just cannot deal with all of them. No, unlike a factory, a school and the teachers specifically cannot discard or fix the raw materials they're provided with. Unlike a factory, and it's a well-proven fact that has been replicated over and over and over, that a student's background will have more of an effect on their educational experiences and eventual educational success than the school they attend. I'm referring specifically to their family's socioeconomic status, their parents' level of education, and cultural capital. These are better predictors of a student's academic achievement than school processes. And that is an opinion. So that's not an opinion, that's a fact. Research in a variety of disciplines, and it's been replicated in all these disciplines, have shown us again and again and again that a student's background is a better predictor of their educational achievement than school processes. Now, if we pause for a moment and think about what do we mean by educational success? Because it's kind of a vague term. Does that only refer to graduating a high school diploma? Does it refer to truly learning and personally incorporating information? Does it refer to becoming more mature and developing a sense of individual responsibility for oneself? Does it refer to developing a sense of social responsibility, or being prepared to work and be a productive citizen, or to standardize test scores? What exactly is educational success? Well, this is connected to what actually occurs in the thousands of classrooms across Canada. The education system overall may be highly bureaucratized, but individual classrooms and the teachers who are in charge of them have a great deal of discretion. They are largely unsupervised, unmonitored, unevaluated in their classrooms. Teachers know what they should do, and they have a standardized curriculum and standardized assessments to do it. We have very specific qualifications necessary to become a qualified teacher, and a regulatory body that certifies teachers, Ontario College of Teachers. But then they're set free to do this all on their own, at their own discretion, relying on their own ideas and decisions, and that is it. And we all trust that every teacher is doing exactly what they're supposed to do at roughly the same level. So at the same time that teaching is highly regulated, teachers still have a lot of individual autonomy in their own classrooms. And I've made this observation more than once myself about the post-secondary system, and I've commented to students how in my earlier years of teaching at Nipissing, I was so surprised that no one from the university or even my specific department asked me what I was doing in my courses. Nobody checked up on me. No one checked or monitored what textbooks I was or was not using, what my course outline included, what topics I focused on, how long my classes were, the methods of assessment I chose, nothing. We could spend every class watching movies, and then I could randomly choose final grades for everybody. And if no one said anything to administration, nobody would catch on. And I'm not being sarcastic. That is the way it is. We have to send in a copy of our course syllabus before our course starts, and that's it. If I say a final exam is not required for a course, administration says, okay. In fact, I've been at Nipissing for 15 years, and the only times I've ever heard of a professor or lecturer being spoken to occurred when a student or students, plural, took it upon themselves to speak to administration. Once was because of a very significant cultural difference. A professor was here for a year or two from another country, and in that country, what is considered okay for a professor to say when communicating with a student is very different from here. So the professor was very dismissive with students, or at least what Canadians would consider rude and arrogant. So the person would say, I don't have time to speak to you right now. I'm busy. Go away. Or they'd say, how could you not understand that? You're supposed to be intelligent if you're a university student. And this person was particularly dismissive of female students. Another time, a professor canceled something like 12 out of the 14 classes for a course with their students and would just give them work to do on their own. It turned out they were having a medical procedure of some kind done, and they knew ahead of time that it would conflict with their teaching schedule. But they didn't want to make their department or the university aware of this because it would have meant reshuffling their course load, and they didn't want to do that. How did the university react? The first professor was spoken to and kind of monitored for the rest of the year, and then their contract was not extended. And the second professor had tenure, so nothing happened. In the K-12 system, it is not quite so lax, but it does have a lot of wiggle room for teachers to maintain their autonomy. When a teacher is going to be evaluated, they know ahead of time. It isn't like the principal just pokes their head in the door and says, surprise. In fact, if that happened, the principal would be reprimanded. Instead, when a teacher is evaluated, they know it's coming. So is that really an accurate reflection of them as a teacher, of their typical preparation for a subject of how they teach? Yes, there are also informal assessments of a teacher. What I mean is teachers may talk amongst themselves about somebody else's failings. So let's say that I, Jennifer, teach grade 5. And for several years, I've had my incoming students from grade 4 lacking some math skills or writing skills, so that I know that grade 4 is not doing everything that they should at that grade level. But that's informal. So a teacher may say something to the principal about another teacher, or a parent might say something, but that's it. So sometimes a teacher may be monitored more closely or more regularly if a problem has been pointed out. This is why schools are referred to as being loosely coupled. On one hand, they're really highly bureaucratized and have top-heavy administration. But on the other hand, in actual classrooms, there's a lot of personal autonomy and room for discretion on the part of the teacher that is not standardized at all. Is it possible to change this so that in actual classrooms and with teachers, we could standardize them more in some way? Like make more teaching methods and activities and all of it the same everywhere? We could try, but good luck with that. And yes, I mean that sarcastically. When somebody is registered as a teacher, it is with the mutual understanding that they have the specialized education and training necessary to do that job well, that they know what they're doing. What is the point of requiring all of this education and training to be a teacher if we're then going to turn around and monitor every little thing they do, every little decision they make, micromanage them? It doesn't make sense, and it's highly unlikely that teachers themselves would be okay with being micromanaged, or that their unions and regulatory bodies would be okay with that. So instead, what we as a society do, and what school boards do, is adopt a logic of confidence, meaning we respect the personal autonomy of teachers. We trust that a person will not be certified as a teacher in our country unless they meet certain requirements. And we trust that the people who are in charge of making sure those requirements or standards are met know what they're doing and do that. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. We adopt a logic of confidence with individual teachers, but we don't do that with schools as a whole. When it comes to a school overall, they are expected to conform in very specific ways, in ways that we as a society have determined that must be standardized, that I've already mentioned, just like any bureaucracy. The overall organization of a school must follow certain standards. There is no choice or variability permitted in any way. And if there is something different, then it's not labeled a regular school, it's labeled an alternative school, which necessarily implies something different from an accepted norm and perhaps less than. If a school organizes classrooms based on ability instead of age, if they don't assess students with any tests at all, and instead are what is known as ungraded schools, whatever it is, this school is considered an alternative to the accepted norm. They are not considered as legitimate as the accepted norm. In other words, the more isomorphic schools are, the more legitimate they are perceived to be. The more similar they are, the more standardized they are, the more legitimate they are perceived to be. And anything considered alternative, let's be honest, is usually considered less than.